Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Skipbound, and this is the 52 must-see movies and why they matter. And this week we are talking about another Western. And like I said before, we're gone off the 52 must-see movies by Robert Osborne and the Essentials. They wrote this book, and it was 52 movies. And myself and a few friends decided, there was more than just 52 essential movies that we should talk about. And so we all nominated a bunch of movies. And this is a movie that I nominated, but I got enlisted a help of one of my old buddies here who did all the episodes of season 1 with me, Mr. Andrew Cabral. Welcome back, Andrew.
I'm glad to be back, Dan. I'm glad to pitch in here and talk about how, but that's just the way time is. Time is very funny.
Yeah, we wrapped up in March, maybe early April, and so now we're in August. So we're gonna do High Noon, just like Andrew said, starring Gary Cooper as the sheriff of this town, Kane, and he is married to Grace Kelley, and her name is Amy. And we also have Loyd Bridges in this film. This is one of Loyd Bridges' first movie he's ever acted in. Also, the villain is Frank Miller, not the comic book artist, but the villain is named Frank Miller, and he's played by Ian McDonald. And also, we have a Ramirez, and her what's her first name? Something Ramirez. The bar.
Helen Ramirez.
Helen Ramirez, and she's played by Katie Gerardo. And this is a big step for a Latino woman to actually have a role in a movie in 1952. Usually they would have blackface or somebody portraying Latinos, which, we see Eli Wallach doing a lot of that in Westerns back in the day. But also this film is directed by Fred Zinnemann, and it has a amazing, incredible score by Dmitri Tomakin. So talk about some of those folks, those actors, the director or the composer, Andrew. What are your thoughts on them?
Yeah, well, the headliner of the movie and why it's so remembered is because it is starring Gary Cooper, who is one of the more famous and well-known American actors probably of all time. He had a great career. The height of his career was probably the 30s and the 40s, and it was interesting as I was doing some homework about this, is that his career was taking a bit of a slide in the late 40s and early 50s, and this movie was kind of a revival for him. He was getting older, and he was his films weren't doing as well at the box office as they previously were. And this movie kind of kickstarted his career. He would pass away, I believed, about 9 or 10 years after this movie came out, at a rather young age of about 61. So Gary Cooper always had that older gentleman look to him, similar to Humphrey Bogart. And he had done some fantastic films in his career. Like I said earlier on, specifically, he did movies like Sergeant York and Mr. Deeds Comes to Town, things like that. He actually won an Oscar, I believe, for this film, as well as for Sergeant York. So this is where he got his 2 Oscars. When it comes to the other actors in the movie, Loyd Bridges is a name I think many people should be familiar with. He's the father of both Beau Bridges and Jeff Bridges, kind of an acting lineage in Hollywood, if you will. Grace Kelley, people know probably more for her role as one of the Hitchcock blondes, which would happen later on in this decade. This is a very early film for her. She's only about 21 years old in this movie, so really seeing her at the very start of her career.
Yeah, absolutely. Grace Kelley, Rear Window, she was fantastic in that. And so what High Noon is based off of a short story called The Tin Star from John W. Cunningham. And a lot of movies back then, they took from like all kinds of different places, books and magazine articles, and just they didn't have as much material as they do now to turn things into movies like comic books and so forth, and all the different stuff. So the Tin Star was a short story in a magazine that they turned into a movie, and that's why we get High Noon. So to start it off, we get a man on a horse and men watching him ride. Then we get, like I said, we have Dmitri Tomikin, and we get this Ballad of High Noon, this song that it plays over the film periodically throughout the film. And it's just such a like melodic song. You just know what this film is when you hear this song. You know, it's such a big part of the film. And sometimes music can do that with films, Andrew. And we get a wedding, and it turns out our stars of Gary Cooper and Grace Kelly, Kane and Amy, are getting married. And we get bells ringing and men ride into town. So talk about some of that stuff. That's the beginning.
Yeah, the very beginning of this movie. This movie is very stripped down when it comes to kind of plot elements. It's also, we should mention, a very short movie. The movie's only about an hour and 25 minutes, so it's very lean, it's very quick, and things get to the point very quickly. Like Dan said at the beginning of this movie, there are these kind of outlaws or marauders, and they're riding into town because we come to find out that they are waiting for the train to come at noon. And on this train is the character that Dan mentioned, who is a pretty bad outlaw himself and has a history with the Gary Cooper character. And right after the wedding is when we kind of find out that this character is returning to town. And that's when Gary Cooper and Grace Kelly's character have to make a decision that they're leaving the town anyway. They might as well leave now because they have a pretty damn good reason to. And what we also find out is that Gary Cooper's character is no longer the marshal of this town. He's leaving. He's getting married. He's going to another town to open up a store, and he's going to live his life someplace else. But now he is at a crossroads of, should he stay here or should he leave? And initially he does leave. The scene that Dan talks about kind of ends with them two riding out of town, and the Loyd Bridges characters in the local, I would say, hotel, if you will, and he's looking out the window and he's seeing them ride away.
Yeah. And they have these men that are riding into town. They're part of Frank Miller's, Ian McDonald's posse, and they're Mr. Pierce and Mr. Colby, and they are part of the group that's going to come and take over the town again. But like you said, they end up having to drag Kane back into town, Marshal Kane back into town, because they find out that he is coming back on the noon train. Ian McDonald's character of Frank Miller is coming back on the noon train. Well, that's why we get the title of the movie, High Noon.
Right.
That's what they called it at the time, High Noon.
And in the scene that after they ride out to town is when we meet the Loyd Bridges character for the first time, and when we meet the Ramirez character for the first time, and they have a bit of a romance going on, a relationship going on that they kind of want to keep secret. That's hinted at throughout the movie, and like Dan said, the bad guys ride out to the train depot. And the train depot guy is actually the one who rides into town to tell everybody what's happening. You know what I mean? It's not like today when, news travels so fast and it's so easily accessible. It's usually just, back then it's usually just one guy knowing the news and then telling it to someone, they tell it to somebody else. And what ends up happening, the long and short of it is that the Gary Cooper character decides, you know what, I'm turning around, I'm coming back to town, and he wants to gather up a posse to confront Frank Miller when he arrives at noon.
And he talks to the judge, and the judge is like, "Nah, sorry, it's all you, buddy. I'm taking off. I'm leaving town."
Yeah, I'm the one who sentenced him. Who do you think he's going to kill first? Probably me.
And of course, he says, one of the lines, a line in the film, he says, he swears he'll kill you. He'll never hang. That's what Frank Miller said, that he swears he's going to come back and kill Marshall Kane, and that he's never going to hang. And well, we find out he didn't hang, and he's coming back to kill Marshall Kane.
Yeah, what is interesting is we find out that Frank Miller was, he's a really bad guy. The town was, a really, a difficult town to live in with Frank Miller and his gang running around. And Marshall Kane kind of cleaned it up, including getting Miller put in jail for murder. And what happened is, he got sentenced to prison. He was supposed to hang, like Dan said, and apparently he ended up getting released instead.
Yeah. And of course, there's some people in the town that don't like Marshall Kane for various reasons. And one of them is the hotel maitre d'. And he believes that Marshall Kane has that comeuppance coming. Comeuppance.
Yes. A comeuppance. And what is interesting is the film is basically, like we said, is him going around to each place to try to get people to join him. And everywhere he turns, everywhere he goes, people say no. He goes to the local saloon where Frank Miller apparently has friends. Nobody will help him there. He goes to the church where the churchgoers are. Nobody will help him there. And he just goes around to even his own friends, people who he trusts. He only gets one guy to commit. He does get one guy to commit, and then the guy's like, okay, I'm gonna go handle some stuff. I'll be back later, and then he goes around and he can't find anybody to commit to this. And we find out that even though he cleaned up this town and people are safe in this town, presumably, people don't like him. And it's interesting. They never really reveal quite why. Like, there's never a definitive reason. What Dan was saying with the hotel manager is he basically blames Kane for the lack of business coming into this town, or the lack of economic prosperity within the town, because he cleaned up all of the riffraff who I guess were populating the town at the time.
Hattiesville, New Mexico is the name of the town. And like you said about the bar, but he walks into the bar, Andrew, and the bartender's bag mouth. I'll bet such and such. Kane doesn't last 5 minutes. Bam, walks right over, punches the bartender right in the face. And
yeah, not the best thing to do if you're trying to convince some guys to be on your side, is to knock out the dude they're all listening to.
No. And the bartender is Sam Fuller. He's basically a coward. That's what cowards do.
The whole town's full of cowards.
Yeah.
But what is interesting is that they rationalize their cowardness. Like they make up excuses, they make up reasons why they shouldn't join the posse. They shouldn't confront Frank Miller when he gets to town. When he goes to the church, and the guy gets up, and you think initially that he's rallying people to get on his side, because a bunch of guys get up and it's like, yeah, we're gonna join you, whatever, we're going in. Then one guy gets up and is like, oh, wait a minute now, let's think about this. This guy, he's a great marshal. He cleaned up this town. He's done some great things for this town. But what's going to happen when Frank Miller comes to town? There's this big shootout and people are dying in the streets. What are people in the North going to think about this when they hear this news? They're going to think this place is ungovernable, and we're not going to be able to create any type of civilization or a town here, because we have to remember that New Mexico at the time wasn't a state yet. It was just the New Mexico territory. It doesn't have statehood or anything like that. So in a sense, it very much is the Wild West.
And I want to go back to Harvey. Harvey, he was shacked up with Ramirez. What's her first name again?
Helen
Ramirez. And she was a saloon owner. It says on the thing, Ramirez Saloon. But she realizes what can happen if Frank Miller takes over again. So she starts packing up her stuff, and she's like, Harvey, if you want anything to do with it, feel free. I don't care. I'm leaving town. And then after that, Marshall Kane goes back and tells her, hey, I just want to let you know that Frank Miller's coming to town. She's like, yeah, I already know. And he's like, oh, I figured you know. And, of course, Amy was downstairs of the hotel because she's waiting on the train. And she starts asking questions. Well, who's Helen Ramirez and this and that? And the maitre d' of the hotel starts telling her. And eventually she goes up and starts talking to Helen Ramirez. And she asks, why is he doing what he is doing? And Helen says, if you don't know, I can't explain it to you.
Yeah.
That is a big line of dialogue that really resonates in this.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We don't know much about the relationship between Amy and Marshall Kane. We know that they obviously know each other well enough to get married, but there seems to be a disconnect to how long she's known him, how well she knows him, and that the Ramirez character seems to know him a lot more. She seems, because what we learned also from, I believe, that hotel manager is that Ramirez had a relationship with the Miller character as well as Marshall Kane as well. They never really come out right away and say if it's romantically based. We can kind of assume that, but there's a lot of that kind of interconnectivity with these characters that they only allude to, they never really explore. And the Ramirez character, like you said, is getting out of town because she doesn't want to deal with the Frank Miller character at all. And we have to also say that Harvey, the Loyd Bridges character, seems to be extremely jealous and possessive of the Ramirez character. And the Ramirez character is a strong character. She is someone who's not going to be pushed around, not going to be, strong-armed in any way. There is that one confrontation between the two. When this is after Harvey has quit. One thing we didn't touch on is Harvey was the deputy, and he straight up quit because he wanted to be the next marshal, and he believes that Kane didn't put in a word for him to be the next marshal, wasn't backing him. So he tried to strong arm Kane and say, hey, I'll back you here, but I'll be the next marshal once this is over. When the new guy gets here tomorrow, you can tell him the job's already been filled. And he's quit as well. So in a way, he's a coward too, just like a lot of the men in this town.
Yeah, and that leads to him going into the bar, watching everything that happens into the bar, and drinking a whole bottle. And this gives him enough courage to go after Marshall Kane. And they get in a fight in the stables. They do, because of what you just talked about. They have a knockout, drag-out fight in the stables, Harvey. And
and the one thing I didn't mention is that he has a confrontation with Ramirez that where she pretty much, puts him down, questions his manhood, if you will. Yeah. And that also leads him to go to the saloon and get drunk and then, get in a fight with Marshall Kane. And then Kane ends up beating him in that fight.
That's right. And this is where we got a couple of things going on at the same time. We get, we hear a train horn. We get Marshall Kane writing a letter to his wife if he dies, and we get really ominous music playing over all of this. That once again, the score really is just really powerful in this film with the Ballad of High Noon and this ominous dark music that's playing over some of the ending scenes.
Yeah, it's Fred Zinnemann is a director I think is very underrated. He's a director who has actually, I believe, won 4 Oscars in his career, which, and I believe 2 or 3 of them were for Best Director. He won Best Director for A Man for All Seasons, and he won Best Director for From Here to Eternity, which was also a Best Picture. From Here to Eternity is an amazing movie. But he also won for Best Documentary back in the 50s, and he also won I believe for another Best Picture winner as well. Yeah, A Man for All Seasons. He was a producer, so he has a lot of pedigree, and he has a lot of skill as a director, as you can see in this movie. Because this movie, like we said, is really short, so there's not a lot going on. But Fred Zinnemann is able to capture the West in a different way. This film is all set in just one location in one town, probably on a backlot set somewhere, on a set somewhere, but he's able to make it feel like it's this wild, wild West town. There's a famous quote, I don't know who it's attributed to, but basically what they say about this movie is that this is a Western for people who don't like Westerns, because it's a Western that is so different than the Westerns at the time. It's like Dan was saying, there's the music is in there, the setting is in there, the placement's in there. There's great theme work going on in this movie. And the only thing in this movie that really feels like a classic Western of its time is the climax of the movie, which is, the final confrontation between the Marshal and Frank Miller when he finally arrives at the town. What is interesting that this Frank Miller character is, once we even see him, he's kind of a regular person. Like, this whole time we hear about how bad he is. He's this big bad guy. He's gonna come back. He's gonna kill you. He's gonna kill Marshal Kane, and in a couple of minutes. That's it. We should just let him run the town or whatever. And the first time we see him, I believe the first shot of him getting off the train is all from behind his head. We don't even see the front of him. And then even in the final fight, he's kind of no big deal. You know what I mean? It's just in our minds through the whole movie where he's built up. He's built up as this bigger than life thing. And the final fight, I think, is really, really good. It's Gary Cooper all on his own against the whole gang of guys. And if you notice, one of the gang is Lee Van Cleef, who, of course, was in the spaghetti westerns later on in his career. But this is actually, I believe, his first movie. He doesn't have any lines in this movie, but this is his first movie.
Yeah, let's not get ahead of ourselves, Andrew.
Well, I mean, we were talking about the third act, so I thought I would allude to the third act as, its connection to the Western genre.
Yeah. No, I completely understand where you're coming from there. But so this is where we get to the third act, like you said. We get Helen and Amy. They get on the train, and guess who's getting off the train? It's Frank Miller. He's getting off the train, and Frank arrives, and his men greet him, of course, and the men walk into town. One guy breaks a window, and he grabs, what is it, a bonnet or something? I
thought it was like a purse or something, a bag, a satchel, something.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why are you doing this now and not after the fight? But whatever.
And then when they come into town, Will, see, this is what's amazing about this, is when they break the window, Will hears them. Will Kane hears them, so he's able to go hide, and while they're walking, he's able to shoot one of the guys. So he knocks out one of the guys right away because they were stupid enough to break the window and alert Will Kane of their presence.
Oh yeah. These guys aren't smart people at all. But the scene right before they arrive into town, there's this one shot I have to point out where it's him standing in the main street and it's completely empty. There is nobody around, and the camera just pans back out just to see how alone he is and how isolated he is. Which I'll talk about the isolation in this movie a little later, because it's for obvious reasons, and there's a point to it. But there's a great shot because, like we said, it's him against the world essentially.
No, you're absolutely right about that. And then when Amy hears the gun go off and she assumes somebody's been shot, she jumps off the train and runs back into town, and she hides somewhere. And I don't know how this happened, but she ended up getting a gun, and she sees a guy who's going after Will Kane, and she shoots this guy in the back.
Yeah, which is very interesting because she's a pacifist. We learn in the movie that she is a Quaker, but not by birth, but by personal choice, because both her father and her brother were killed by guns and violence. So she doesn't want anything to do with it. She really doesn't want anything to do with the Marshal taking on these guys at all, which is why she wants to get on a train and get out of there.
That's right. And So now we're down to two guys, and Will, they kind of corner Will in a barn, and Frank Miller throws a lantern into the barn, which sets the barn on fire and sets the hay on fire. And just like a good guy that he is, Will Kane decides, you know what? I'm not going to let these good horses go to waste. I'm going to let these horses go. I'm going to hide on one of the horses while they're running out. I'm going to run out with one of them on their back. So he had a plan with releasing the horses because he was able to get out of there because they had him trapped. But he was able to shoot one of the guys before they were able to get him.
Yeah, so I think he's running away, and then I think one of the guys shoots and he falls off the horse. But I think he turns and then he shoots the guy who's shooting him. But then he goes and he hides because it's just down to him and Frank Miller.
And Frank finds out where he was like, why did one of my guys get shot right there? Frank, what's his face is over there. So he goes around the building and he goes inside. And he finds out that it's Amy, and he captures Amy.
Yes.
And then he comes out on the street and he says, Will Kane, come out. I got your woman. And he's like, all right, I'll come out. If you release her, I'll come out. So he starts coming out, but she, like a feisty lady that she is, she ain't going down or anything. She scratches him in the face, which then releases her from him. Then he gets away, and Will's able to shoot him right in the middle of the street.
Right, and then he, of course, he goes over to see if Amy's okay, and again she's okay. What is interesting, where she was hiding was his marshal's office, and that's where all the guns are, obviously.
Well, that's where
Harvey's
gun was. He hung it.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that's the gun she used. Like, I'm like 100% on that, because early on when Harvey quit, he takes off his gun belt and he hangs it on a peg. And there's a shot of that gun like later on, that they linger on for a little bit earlier on in the movie, and like, oh, I wonder if that's going to come back and play a part in this, and it does. And that's when, of course, he grabs her. But one of my favorite parts is after this is over, after he shoots Frank Miller, he's dead, he has his wife. That's when all the town folk come out. They just come out of the woodwork like, oh, it's over? Oh, how'd it go? You know? And then you get, and then the scene, what he does at the very end.
Well, the wagon, the boy brings out the wagon with the horses, because that's what he had the boy. One of the things he had the boy do, because the boy wanted to fight with him. And he said, no, go back.
Yeah.
So the boy brings out the wagon with the horses. He hugs Amy. He gets on, before he gets on the wagon with Amy, he throws the star into the dirt. They get on the wagon with the horses, and then they ride off. And that's
and then there's the shot of I think there's a shot of the badge in the dirt, like right down in the dirt. Which is a very powerful moment. It's very small, but it's very symbolic of almost like it like almost purging himself of the responsibilities of being a marshal. I think also saying a statement that, almost like the whole time he doesn't say what he really wants to say to these people, and in that moment, I think that symbolizes what he wants to say. You know what I mean? That, here, take it, I'm done. You ungrateful people, here you go. I'm out.
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, I want to go back to the shot of him in the street, but they're building to that scene throughout the entire movie when he's going to the different people, and one of the real key one to me was when he was at the wedding and everything was fine, and he was one of his best buddies and stuff. Lon Chaney, he goes to his house and he's like, hey, I need you. You one of my best friends in the whole world. He's like, Frank, I got messed up hands. I got messed up knuckles. I got arthritis. I can't do any good. I can't do any good for you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, he goes to see Lon Chaney Jr., who I guess was the marshal before he was the marshal.
Apparently.
And it's like he's pretty much at the end of any viable candidates, because even before that, he goes to see somebody who we are told is his best friend,
One of his best
And
friends.
the guy is such a coward. He won't even tell him to his face that he doesn't want to do it. He has his wife do it, and and she's like, he's gonna know I'm lying. You know, I'm not. And then of course he knows she's lying because she says, we went, he went to church or whatever, and it's like, oh, without you, and she's like, oh yeah, I'm just getting dressed. I'm on my way there now, or something like that. And he's like, no, he's hiding. He knows he's hiding in the back of the house.
It's Sam Fuller, another great actor that you might know of. Harry Morgan. Harry Morgan. Now, Harry Morgan is a famous actor. He did some TV in the 80s, but this is one of his big roles that he was in early on in his career. What was it? The policeman. They did a remake. Tom Hanks and Dan Aykroyd did.
Dragnet.
Say that again. Dragnet.
Dragnet.
That's right.
Yeah, Dragnet.
Harry Morgan
yeah.
is from Dragnet.
Well, he was also famously in MASH.
MASH too. Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
MASH. I forgot about that. MASH. That's right. Those are the two things. So Harry Morgan is the friend, and he, like you said, he asked his wife to go out there and do it for him, and so nobody wants to stand with Will Kane,
and even the guy who said he would stand with him, who comes back later, who I talked about earlier, he backs out as well. He's like, when he comes back, he's like, okay, how many? Like, all right, where are the fellas going to be here? We got to start planning. And Marshall King goes, we couldn't get anybody. And the guy's like, I got a family. I don't want to die. Here you go. But if you can get guys, I'll be back.
Yeah. So that isolation scene, it really plays a major role in the film because it's in on the marketing as well. It's like, my DVD copy. He's on the cover by himself, standing in the middle of the street, and so it just tells you that what kind of a man would go up against these four men with the reputation of Frank Miller and what he did prior to the 5 years. The town's been prosperous and everybody's happy. And this comes up a couple times. 5 years he's been the marshal and everything's fine, no problems. Women could walk down the street. Now, but when Frank Marshall was around, was the hotel prosperous and the saloon busy? Sure. But were people safe? No. And that's why it's such a iconic scene of Gary Cooper standing in the middle of the street. What more do you have to add on that, Andrew?
Well, what I was alluding to earlier about the overall isolation theme that's throughout this movie is that this movie is an allegory to what was going on in Hollywood and in the country at the time with the House Un-Americans Committee, with the blacklisting in Hollywood and all that stuff. And this movie is basically an allegory that is saying about how the Hollywood community, wouldn't support the people that were being called out, how they turned their backs on them, how there were people who were betraying their friends and things like that, and how just the overall division within Hollywood was that existed at the time. It was a very interesting time in the whole Hollywood, the whole history of Hollywood, and a lot of important things happened. A lot of people who were immensely talented couldn't get work at all. A lot of people's careers and livelihoods were destroyed because of it. And High Noon is kind of showing all of that. It's very interesting that one of the people who was at the forefront of attacking others within the Hollywood community was John Wayne, and John Wayne hated this movie. Coincidentally, John Wayne loathed this movie. He hated this movie so much that he and Howard Hawks remade this movie in 1959 called Rio Bravo, and basically how Rio Bravo is kind of the opposite of this movie, where the guy was able to stand on his own without asking for help. Do you know what I mean? Like that's another thing about this movie. This movie challenges the idea of masculinity within the West. How no matter what, the good guys wouldn't ask for help because they're so good at what they do. It's every character John Wayne pretty much ever played in the West. You know what I mean? Coincidentally, Gary Cooper wasn't at the Academy Awards to receive his Oscar, and you know who accepted his Oscar on his behalf was John Wayne.
Oh my!
It's a very weird, trivial stuff that comes up.
Wow.
But if you're interested in this, there's a lot of stuff people can read about it. The guy who wrote the screenplay, Carl Foreman, was one of the people who was blacklisted by Hollywood when this movie came out. He was already kicked out of Hollywood, and he was already in I think England or Europe somewhere, trying to get work. It's very interesting. It's an interesting political tone in this movie because this movie's produced by Stanley Kramer, who, if you're familiar with the films that Stanley Kramer did, they are very political. He did movies like Inherit the Wind. He did films like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, films that were really political at the time. And this movie does have political undertones within it, which I think is why it gets remembered, not only because it's a good movie, but because of the political undertones in it, how it's such a part of its time. But there's also things you can extrapolate into modern times as well. This is a really good movie. Yet again, it's not a traditional Western. There aren't people riding on horsebacks. There aren't a lot of gunfights in it. It's not a typical John Wayne Western, but it's a very good Western.
Well, there you go. You hit the nail on the head. It's a very good Western. But when you look at the cast, you don't get all these great actors signing up for crappy movies. You get great actors signing up for great movies. And this cast, unbelievable. I mean, the supporting cast of Lon Chaney and I want to talk about somebody really quick before we wrap it up here. Katie Girardo. All right. So this is a woman who is an abs Mexican woman. They are not in any movies in Hollywood at this time. They are always portrayed in by white actors and actresses or in blackface. So for her to be able to be in a movie in 1952 and have some of the lines of dialogue that she has, powerful lines of dialogue, bossing Loyd Bridges, and then holding her own against Gary Cooper and Grace Kelly, that tells you how powerful of an actress she was, and they wanted somebody that could hold their own in that role. And that really resonated with me as far as the film goes, because you don't see that back then.
As in something wash or they were just a real genuine that really just take it distribute them. Where it only played like tour, a song felt hero who standing shout the mounter and you'll learn in the miss he that but what props one of the sound bay one of bass because she him told him to ask him to rush leaving. I shouldn't leave you available. And he thank you for all the man the hell out. Is it is that guess there isn't it because I like he's sincere, but I've when I said about like a shop, said by thing of that body and saw cheesy way a positive figure.
Yeah. So that's we really shed some light on this film that was the book the book has 52 movies, and they're all phenomenal movies. But when we did this and we were able to nominate a bunch of them, I nominated High Noon. I felt that this is a film that deserves to be talked about in this a series. And so when we did season 2, I decided, well, I want High Noon. I want to discuss this film. And I'm glad I got you to help me, Andrew, because you really shed a lot of light on, you know, on this film and brought a lot to this conversation. So I just really want to say thank you for deciding to do this with me.
Let's movies. Glad that season of philosophies they matter.
All right, so Andrew, where can you be found?
Me, my product as my acquisitions.
All right, you can find me at Dan Skip Allen on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest, or at From the Fourth Row at WordPress.com or Cinesportstalk.com. That's CINESPORTSTALK.com, where I do write reviews about sports and movies. So, for Andrew and myself, good night.